Welcome to Payback Channel. My name is Thomas Allen Moon. I'm the host and creator of the Payback Channel. The purpose of the Payback Channel is to help Americans who have ordinary money-making skills, in other words, America's middle class, understand what they have at stake regarding how much America taxes, how it taxes, and who it taxes. In this episode and the next two episodes, I'll discuss how the unchecked growth of the national debt threatens both to shred America's social fabric and poison its political process. In this episode, I'll discuss the circumstances under which the national debt has grown to a dangerous level. The national debt results from the government failing to tax to pay for what it spends. Each year, the national debt grows faster than the GDP. The tax burden is shifted from the current generation of taxpayers to future generations. The shifting of the tax burden from one generation of taxpayers to another results in intergenerational theft. Intergenerational theft occurs when one generation steals from victim generations by sticking the victims with a tab for what they have failed to tax themselves to pay for what they got from government. Put simply, the thieving generation gets the benefits of government largesse and passes the burden of paying for it on to victim generations. Victim generations suffer a lower standard of living than thieving generations because victim generations have to pay higher taxes and get less from government as a result for their having to pay for the misdeeds of thieving generations. Thieving generations don't earn their higher standard of living in the marketplace. They win it in the political process. For those who wonder why thieving generations are able to steal from victim generations, the answer is that thieving generations vote and victims don't. Intergenerational theft is no different in principle than a parent stealing from their child because the parent has power and the child doesn't. Getting government for a fraction of its cost is and always has been appealing to many voters. The ease of one generation stealing from another explains why the national debt has grown to a dangerous level and is on track to grow much higher. The extent of intergenerational theft reveals the degree of hypocrisy of those voters and politicians who fret about the futures of their children and grandchildren while at the same time lobbying for debt-financed tax cuts for themselves. Shifting the tax burden from one generation to another may be excused only if it's necessary for either ending a recession or coping with a national emergency, such as a war or natural disaster. Once a recessionary emergency crisis ends, there's no excuse for not replacing the borrowed funds as quickly as prudence permits, even if it means a tax increase. Intergenerational theft that finances tax cuts which benefits households in the top 1% of income and wealth more often than not are saved and added to their wealth. Intergenerational theft that finances tax cuts which benefit households in the bottom 90% of income almost always are spent on just getting by and don't add to their wealth. So to the extent that intergenerational theft finances tax cuts for households in the top 1% of income and wealth, they add to the disparity in wealth between the top 1% and all others. The willingness to increase the national debt and the danger of doing so are determined by the economic, social, and political climate of the time. As shown in prior episodes, the national debt rose steadily from less than 40% of GDP in 1980 to over 100% in 2019 amidst the following trends. America as a whole became much richer in that per capita personal income in inflation-adjusted dollars rose 167% from $32,550 in 1980 to $54,460 in 2018. While real per capita income grew at a rate of 167%, real median personal income grew from $23,113 in 1980 to $33,706 in 2018, or the growth rate 21 percentage points less than the growth of per capita personal income. America's income and wealth have both concentrated in the top in that the shares of both income and wealth of households in the bottom 90% fell steadily and substantially, but the shares of both income and wealth in households of the top 1% rose steadily and substantially. Globalization and automation each displaced workers with ordinary skills and suppressed their wages. Only a very small percentage of households, probably less than 5%, made enough market income to maintain a middle-class standard of living, fund their own retirement, pay for their own health care, pay for the post-secondary education of their children, save for a family emergency, and endure a 3-month job interruption. 4 major tax cuts were enacted, each of which overwhelmingly favored households in the top 1% of income and wealth. After each tax cut, the national debt as a percentage of GDP rose significantly. Annual deficits in tax revenues available to pay for government spending have grown to about 5% of GDP and are projected to increase. The per capita national debt quintupled in inflation-adjusted dollars, rising from $12,734 in 1980 to $65,594 in 2018. Looking back, it wasn't enough that the standard of living of most Americans was rising because of the growth of personal income. Those who controlled the political process chose to jack it up even more by engaging in intergenerational theft. Except for a few years in the mid-1990s, every year the national debt grew faster than GDP, meaning that each annual crop of taxpayers was stealing from future taxpayers. It wasn't an accident that the national debt grew faster than GDP. It was the result of the 4 tax cuts, all of which were debt financed. Leading generations didn't earn their increased standard of living in the marketplace. Instead, they won it in the political process by politicking debt-financed tax cuts to be paid for by victim generations. Not all taxpayers enjoyed the same benefits from intergenerational theft of the last 2 generations. Since all 4 tax cuts benefited those in the top 1% in both income and wealth, it was almost exclusively the top 1% that were made wealthier because of the theft. Leading generations didn't use the tax cuts to mitigate the concentration of wealth and income in the top 1%. Rather, they used them to make the top 1% much, much better off, and the bottom 90% a tiny bit better off, all at the expense of victim generations. It's an anomaly that in a country presumably governed by one person, one vote, the political process chose to use intergenerational theft to further enrich the top 1% at a time when the marketplace was already enriching them to an unprecedented degree, while everyone else was struggling just to keep their heads above water. So much for the past 40 years. Going forward, the ongoing trends of the last 2 generations are likely to have the following effects. Households in the bottom 90% of income will become increasingly dependent on social insurance for retirement, health care, post-secondary education, a safety net in case of job loss or a medical emergency. Increased dependency on social insurance will increase government spending substantially. More and more workers with ordinary skills will live in constant fear of losing their jobs and not being able to find another with comparable or better wages. Households in the bottom 90% of income will likely continue to be less able to pay higher taxes without it significantly reducing their standard of living. Households in the top 1% of income will likely continue to prosper far more than others. All this means that trends for the foreseeable future will include the following. The national debt will rise steadily and substantially unless and until taxes are raised and/or spending is cut. Most households in the bottom 90% of income would face a politically unbearable reduction in their standard of living if they were to pay higher taxes or lose their benefits under social insurance. Households in the top 1% of income can afford to pay much, much higher taxes without it materially affecting either their standard of living or ability to invest in the economy. These effects, which have been brewing over the last 40 years, now force America to confront new realities. First, spending on social insurance must increase in order to sustain the standard of living of households in the bottom 90% of income. Second, increased spending on social insurance will force a substantial further increase in the national debt unless taxes are raised. Third, if the national debt is to be contained, taxes must be raised substantially. Fourth, the only income group that can pay higher taxes without significantly affecting either its standard of living or its ability to invest are those households in the top 1% of income. Please join me for the next episode discussing how the unchecked growth of the national debt endangers America. Thanks for watching.